Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. I normally talk to you about books I've finished, but today I'm going to talk to you about books I DNFed. So DNF, if you don't know, stands for did not finish. So it's a term people use to describe books that they haven't managed to get through for whatever reason. I've talked about DNFing on the channel before, about how I think it's a really important skill and how we shouldn't feel guilty about not finishing books that aren't working for us. But somebody in the comments asked me the other day if I could provide a list of all the books I've DNF'd, which I would struggle to do. But what I was already planning to do, fortuitously, was do this video where I talk about some of the books that I haven't finished, and we'll talk in this video about why I didn't finish them. So I've got 10 books on this list to talk to you about. And what I've got, the way I've got my Goodreads set up, is you can have on Goodreads, you can set up your own shelf. So like the standard shelves you get on Goodreads. If you don't know, Goodreads is like a website, an app where you can track your reading. So your standard shelves on Goodreads are to read, reading and read. And those are like exclusive shelves. So a book can only be in one of those three shelves. It can't be in more than one because it wouldn't make sense for it to be, would it? And then you can also set up, your own random shelves, like, books I've read for a book club or whatever, and books can be in both one of the three exclusive shelves and in the new shelf. But you can also create new exclusive shelves, if you like, where books can only be in one. I'm rambling and not really making sense, but hopefully you get what I'm saying. So I've actually got 4 exclusive shelves. So I've got the 3 standard ones, to read, reading and read. And then I've also got an unfinished shelf where I put books that I just haven't managed to finish for whatever reason. And I do distinguish between books that I've just picked up and read like the first chapter or something like that and gone, I'm not in the mood for this at the moment. So I think if you just pick up a book and start it and you're just not feeling it, and sometimes in the first few pages if it's the right time for you in that book, if you're just not feeling it, then I don't put it in my unfinished shelf. I'd just put it in my to read shelf. I'd put it back in that shelf. But if I've got a decent way through a book, like 50 pages plus normally, and sometimes a lot more than that, then I will file it in my unfinished shelf. And I do intend to, I do look through that shelf every so often and think, are there books here that I should give another go to? I've talked before in one of my DNF videos about the book The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is a book I DNF'd twice before giving it a go a third time. And the third time I read it, I absolutely loved it. I flew through it, really, really enjoyed it. And I consider it to be, I'm not sure I'll go so far as to say it's one of my favourite books, but I do, it was definitely a 5-star read. So let me talk to you then about the 10 books I've got on I've got more than 10 books on my unfinished shelf. The 10 books I want to talk to you about today that I DNF'd. And what I won't do is there's 3 books that I've DNF'd fairly recently that I've kind of talked about on the channel before. So I'm not going to cover those. But those ones were War and Peace, which I talked about very recently, which was just a struggle. And actually 4 books actually. So in a similar vein, the brothers Karamazov or Krasimov, whatever it is, by Dostoevsky, which again was just too big and too Russian for me. And Great Expectations by Dickens, which I was just not feeling at all when I read it. And I gave it, a decent number of pages, but just wasn't getting into it. And then the other one is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which I know is a book that lots of people love. I know that Steve Donohue's, doing a big group read of it at the moment, but I just thought that was such a boring book. I just couldn't get into it at all. So I won't talk about those ones, having already talked about them a little bit. So I've got 10 other books for you. So let's go through them. Right, so the first one then is Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts. So if you don't know what Shantaram is a huge book. I think it's over 1,000 pages, which is supposedly based on truth, written by this Australian guy who was like travelling around India and got arrested and got into all sorts of problems, and it's basically his supposedly true retelling of what happened to him. And it's one of those books that some people absolutely love, and it was recommended to me by someone who was reading it at the time. Her husband had read it, her husband loved it, she was reading it, she was really enjoying it, and she recommended it to a group of us who were in a book club with her at the time. And I started it, and it is quite engaging at first. It's quite fast paced, it's quite colourful, but much like War and Peace and The Brothers Karamazov and Great Expectations, just the weight of the size of the book felt like a literal weight on my shoulders, and I just couldn't face putting myself through reading all 1,000+ pages of it. As entertaining as it was, it just felt too drawn out and too padded, and I just didn't feel like I had in me enough interest for the book to keep reading through that huge number of pages. Now, ironically, the person who recommended it to me also DNF'd it, having raved about it to loads of people. So I think it's one of those books that makes a great first impression on people, but that first impression can sour fairly quickly. Okay, another one in a similar vein then, and this is a book I've tried to read. I think I've tried to read the physical book of it twice, and I've tried the audio book once as well. But is one I do want to go back and try again at some point, and that is Shogun by James Clavell. So another huge book, over 1,000 pages. His historical epic of ancient Japan. And it's really quite engaging and exciting when I started reading it, and he does a good job of not involving too much, of not making it feel too complex. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot for you to take in terms of the culture and the the hierarchy, if you like, of the local nobles and things like that in the area of Japan he's writing about. But because he shows it to you all through the eyes of an outsider, it makes it quite digestible. But again, I just couldn't face all of those pages, so I did DNF that one. Okay, next up then, and this is a much shorter book, and it's interesting because the reason I DNF'd this book was the concept, but it was the concept that drew me to it in the first place. So that book is The Bees by Lillian Paul, and this is a book that's about bees, basically. So it's kind of like a YA fantasy novel, but where all the characters are bees, which initially seemed like quite an interesting idea to me, but within, I guess, 50 pages of starting it, I realised that it just felt a bit dumb. And apologies if you're a huge fan of the bees. I know lots of people really, really like it, but I just couldn't face reading about bees any more than I managed to. Next one then is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. So a very well-respected Afrofuturist sci-fi novel, which loads of people I know have read and loved. As I say, it's very well-respected. It won multiple awards. I just found it too complicated. So it's about a very different kind of world set up to the one that we live in. And I just really struggled to grasp exactly what it was that was being explained to me as the way the world works, and that stopped me from being able to connect with the characters. So I just found it felt too much like hard work to me. So again, that's one I DNF, which is a shame because it's one of those ones where, I don't know if you can see them on the shelves there. I've got all 3 books in the trilogy because I was really fired up by the concept of it, and ended up buying all 3 books before starting the first one, and then didn't finish the first one. Okay, next, another big book that I was really looking forward to reading. That book is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. And I think the reason I was looking forward to reading it and the reason I DNF'd it are the same thing, which is I'm a big fan of the TV show. So, it's spawned this very successful TV show. My wife and I both love it. It's one of the few TV shows we watch together, to be honest with you. It is kind of, time travel, romantic adventure with all sorts of stuff going on in it. And it's a lot of fun. The problem with the book is it's huge, and the TV show is very faithful to it. So what I found as I was reading it was I knew what was going to happen. And also, because I knew what was going to happen, I was kind of waiting for the next thing to happen. And it felt like Diana Gabaldon spent a long time getting to the next thing happening. It's quite a verbose book, and certainly, certainly very long. I don't know exactly how long it is, but it's, hundreds and hundreds of pages. So that one, I decided that it just wasn't, it didn't feel to me personally like it was worth the effort, especially as if I finished that one, I would then have however many more books there are in the series to read. So yeah, that one got DNF'd. Next, a book that I was really looking forward to reading, that loads of people whose opinions I respect rave about, but that I found, again, just didn't work for me. And I'm musing about why it didn't work for me. And I think I have a theory. So that book is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. So I bought a bunch of his books secondhand a while ago because I'd heard great things about them. I then subsequently bought them all on Kindle again because they were in a Kindle deal. And was really looking forward to reading them. So these are kind of heroic fantasy books that are supposed to be just have decent world building, but just be really entertaining and gripping, and just good fun adventure type reads. And what I found when I was reading it was, at first I enjoyed it, and there's the kind of two different characters that the action focuses on, and it kind of, in the beginning part of the book at least, kind of flips between the two. One of the characters I really enjoyed, the other one I didn't enjoy as much. And the more I read, the more I realised that this kind of heroic fantasy type stuff, which I used to love as a teenager, just doesn't really appeal to me anymore. It feels a bit too distant from everyday life for me to get really gripped by it. And I as I say, I'm not really sure why that is, because I like, sci-fi and things like that. But for some reason, fantasy just doesn't really seem to float my boat anymore. Maybe I need to try some different fantasy and exercise those fantasy reading muscles a bit more, and then go back to The Blade Itself. Next up then, a book by an author who I've read several books by over the years and quite enjoyed all of them. This one I've tried 2 or 3 times, and for some reason I just cannot get on with it. That book is Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. And it doesn't feel to me like it's really any different from any of his other books. He very much writes to a formula. His books are, very, very silly, despite all the kind of mumbo jumbo he injects into them to make them seem deep and meaningful. But yeah, for some reason, Angels and Demons just doesn't work for me. I don't know if I'll give it another go at some point in the future. But to be honest, I think I'm probably over Dan Brown now, as many of us are. Next, a book then by someone who I'd read one other book by them, which I absolutely loved. Well, let me tell you what the book is first. So the book is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. So I read Chbosky's book, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which I talked about quite recently on the channel, actually. I think it was a random book from the shelves. And I love that book. I thought it was so moving, just wonderfully written, great characters. I really, really liked it. So when I saw he'd published a horror novel, like a big horror novel that was being compared to Stephen King, I thought, well, that sounds really interesting, because that's the kind of book I like, and it's written by an author who I really like. But when I came to read it, I just found that it just felt too drawn out. It really felt like it needed the attention of a very strict editor just to bring it down again. It all felt like it was moving too slowly. And whilst there was definitely a nice kind of creepy atmosphere to it, it just wasn't working for me for some reason. Okay, 2 books to go. The next one is the most mysterious book on this list, because I remember really, really enjoying it, and I can't for the life of me think why I stopped reading it. So that book is Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill, which is a sci-fi book about a robot in this kind of like dystopian kind of future world. And as I say, I was really enjoying it. It's really gripping. It's quite humorous. It's got a lot of action, and it felt like it had everything going for it, but for some reason I put it down, and I'm not sure if it's because there was another book that I needed to read for some particular reason, and I just never went back to Sea of Rust, or if there was something it did that annoyed me, but if there was, I certainly don't remember that. So that's one that I'm definitely going to give another try to, because as I say, my memories of it are a very good ones. Right, so the final book is probably, I think maybe some of the books on this list will be books that people were surprised that I DNF'd. I don't think this last one will surprise anyone, albeit it's not a classic like War and Peace or anything like that. So this is one of those books that's kind of famously experimental and difficult. And I love the concept, but it just felt like too much at the time that I tried to read it. So that book is Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman, which, if you don't know, it is a very long book. I'm not sure exactly how long it is, but I think it's around the kind of 800-page mark. But it's basically one paragraph. So it's a stream of consciousness from this kind of suburban housewife just talking about everything that occurs to her for 800 pages. I started reading it, and I think part of my problem with it is, and maybe this is a book actually that would lend itself well to my style of reading. So I'm someone who quite often reads in short bursts. I do have periods of time, particularly at the weekends, when I'm able to sit down and just completely focus on reading for, kind of 2 or 3 hours. But a lot of my reading is done, in short bursts while I'm cooking, or, in the evening while my wife's watching TV. I'll put some headphones on and read, things like that. So I quite often get distracted away from what I'm reading by other things and then have to go back to it. And I think maybe that stream of consciousness style in Ducks Newburyport made it difficult for me to pinpoint exactly where I'd got to, which may have made that reading experience more frustrating than it would have been if I'd made focus time to read it. So maybe that's one I'll try again. When I originally tried to read it, I had it out in the library. I've subsequently bought it for Kindle because it was reduced. So yeah, maybe that's another one I'll give a go at some point. As I say, I do quite like the idea of it, albeit it's very different from a lot of the more narrative-based fiction which I tend to read. So reflecting back on that list then, and also on some of my recent DNFs, the thing that leaps out at me is something that many of these books have in common is size. So a lot of these books are long books. And I think I'm someone who is, rightly or wrongly, always thinking about what I'm going to be reading next. And I think having the channel maybe means that I do that more than I might do otherwise, because I have to think about books to read to create content. So devoting, several days to one book often, can feel like a bit of a challenge to me. So maybe I do need to set myself aside a month when I take some of that pressure off myself, so I can pay attention to some longer books and give them a try. Maybe try some of these again. Shogun is one that I definitely want to give another try to, and that's one of the big ones. So length is definitely something. And I think the other thing that a lot of these books have in common is expectation. So I think a lot of these books are books where people I respected and raved about them, or there was something that I found particularly interesting about the concept of the book, that meant that I thought I was going to have a good time with it. And maybe my expectations were too high. And maybe if I'd gone into some of these books blind, without any expectation of what it was going to be like, I wouldn't have DNF'd them, because maybe they wouldn't have fallen short of my expectations. And it may have been I would have finished them and loved them. I think that may be the case. So reflecting back on The Secret History, the first time I tried to read that was after someone had very, very passionately recommended it to me. It was like the best thing they'd ever read. And I think going into it, I had that, that kind of expectation for it. And so I think, sometimes when you try a book and fail at it, when you go back to it, as I did with The Secret History, you know what to expect. And that can maybe help you to get past the thing that blocked you with it first time around. So I think there's definitely merit in trying to read books again that you've DNF'd, but I think you need to do that in a considered way. And I certainly still think that DNFing is very often the right thing to do, because, as I said before, you're not saying you're never going to read that book. You're just saying you're not going to read it today. Okay, time for a random book from the shelves, and this then is a book with red flags all over it, because A, as you can see, it's very long, and B, it's a book that many people rave about and that I am really looking forward to reading at some point. So as you can see, it's 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. So supposed to be a fantastic and kind of complex crime epic. So yeah, I'm very keen to read this, but I am worried that my expectations of it are going to cause me problems, and I'll end up not finishing it. I think it's one that I need to make sure I fit into my schedule when I've really got time to devote to it, so I don't end up feeling, as I've said, that pressure of other things I need to read. But yeah, definitely looking forward to giving it a try at some point. So I hope you found that interesting. Let me know your thoughts on DNFing, whether it's something you do. Let me know if any of the books I talked about are ones that kind of rung a bell with you in terms of you struggling to read them as well. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.